I want to do a book review for Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream. This book was authored by Lerone Bennett Jr., and it was printed in the year 2000. This is a must-read. It's an excellent book. Not without criticism, though. Mr. Bennett does a fabulous job of research in this book. Research on people who knew Lincoln, people who chronicled Lincoln's life, who were colleagues of Lincoln before the myth of Lincoln kicked in. Because the myth of Lincoln is obviously not who Lincoln was. And it is not difficult to discern who Lincoln was by his acts, his activity through primary sources. The Emancipation Proclamation. If you read it, you'll see that the Emancipation Proclamation in no way freed slaves. In fact, it maintained slavery. And it was written at a time that Congress had passed a law that Lincoln used the Emancipation Proclamation to slow down the emancipation of slaves done by Congress and overrode that by the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a very lawyerly written document that actually meant nothing, which he immediately said in primary sources. He said, this is not going to hold up in court. He said, this is a war act. And he was very, very sympathetic to the slave owner. Always had been. Never said that he wasn't. So Abraham Lincoln was very consistent, which is part of the faults of this book. But what is the strength of the book is that Mr. Lerone touches on the perpetuated myth of Abraham Lincoln, even up to Eric Foner, who's one of the foremost experts in Lincoln, as to where people have been so whitewashed in the myth of Lincoln that they ignore realities about Lincoln and Lincoln's writing. Number one, the Emancipation Proclamation maintained slavery. It did not free slaves that Lincoln could have freed. So this was done purposefully. The 13th Amendment, we now know, was as lawyerly written as the Emancipation Proclamation. It really didn't free anybody either. And a lot of people get caught up in the 13th and 14th Amendment. People have to understand, if the 13th and 14th Amendment meant anything to black people, we wouldn't have had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So that meant absolutely nothing. We know that the exception clause within the 13th Amendment maintained slavery and made sure that slavery had a place even until today, which is why we went through convict leasing, we went through Jim Crow, we went through civil rights, we went through the war on drugs, and now we're sitting in the midst of mass incarceration. So nothing has changed. Slavery is still in the United States. It is in the form of criminalizing a particular group to use them as free labor, which is consistent verbatim with the 13th Amendment. Mr. Bennett, attacked the Lincoln fable in every way possible that is credible. People who knew Lincoln, colleagues of Lincoln, black colleagues of Lincoln, primary sources, secondary sources, legislation, and it is almost irrefutable, the point that he's making. The problem is, in the book, he overstates his theme to the point the theme overshadows the information. State your theme and let your work support itself. It's constantly going back to how horrible of a dude Lincoln is. And if you really look at the primary sources that he is citing, Lincoln was consistent. Lincoln was not he wasn't as hypocritical or just a flat out liar as a lot of people say it was. Lincoln always said that he had no interest in black people, he had no interest in equality with black people. If he had an issue with slavery, it is probably less likely that it is connected to his being farmed out by his dad to work and his dad getting the money, and more so aligned with his noticing that the northern economy was based on industry and the southern economy was based on slavery. And he saw these two economies coming to a head. They were hitting each other. Something had to give. And being a northern man, he leaned toward the northern economy. And what allowed the South to secede from the Union and rebel in the country was that they were financially viable to do so, the entire King Cotton premise. Well, what Lincoln needed to do to make sure, A, the Union got back together, and B, it never happened again, was to remove the source that empowered the South to be able to secede in the first place, which was their financing to do so. So take their ability to fund their rebellion or separation, which means they have to come back, and now we function under one economy, which later ended up being a global economy. It's the same thing. So my issue with Mr. Bennett is it's an overstating of hypocrisy on the part of Lincoln when the primary sources don't really support that as much as Eric Foner, for example, has Lincoln coming under this huge epiphany at age 54 when he died at age 56, that in 1862 or 1863, he just begins to see equality as the way, which there is nothing consistent with that either one. That's not consistent with natural human behavior, that a person grows less, that they do a 180 in their 50s. That just doesn't sound right. The primary sources lean toward Lincoln using his political savvy, his legal expression and use of words to balance his support throughout the country to bring the Union together. He always stated that his number one priority was the country and the Union, and that he supported the Constitution, and the Constitution supported slavery. He saw where slavery was an issue that was risky, that was challenging the validity of the country. It was challenging what the Constitution represented. So that was why he really pushed for ultimately a control on slavery. He wanted slow emancipation in, again, his interests of the economies, but he also had a high sensitivity for the white slave owners being put out, that their cooks and cleaners and farmers and hands and help and all of that would be gone. So this was something that he consistently stated. To come with fact after fact, quote after quote, is very, very strong. I just think that Mr. Bennett moves away from the scholarly writing, and I understand that he's not a PhD, which you don't have to be a PhD to write a great book, and this is a great book. It just turns into a black book because it seems it has that he was bad, he was bad, he was bad, the abolitionists were good. It's not Lincoln's fault that abolitionists aligned themselves with his fame. Abolitionists aligned themselves with the 13th Amendment, and misrepresented the 13th Amendment. They aligned themselves with the Emancipation Proclamation, and they misrepresented the Emancipation Proclamation. So the heroes that he's trying to make, they weren't heroes. You got to understand, the 13th Amendment did not do anything that he says the 13th Amendment did. He said the 13th Amendment freed black people. The 13th Amendment didn't free black people. I don't understand how he wrote this book in the year 2000 and is not aware that black people did not become citizens of the United States until 1964. If anybody questions that, why do we have a Civil Rights Bill in 1964? Because you got to understand, they were killing black people all the way up until 1970. The most famous ending with Fred Hampton in Chicago, Black Panthers. And we know by way of the COINTELPRO papers that that was the FBI that did that. Obviously, starting with Medgar Evers through Martin Luther King in 68. So great book, again. Forced into Glory, his point is that Lincoln was pushed by the abolitionists and forced to make these concessions against slavery, and that it was not his desire. The problem with it is that it portrays Lincoln as creating the myth that made him. To an extent, he played politics, but the ultimate myth was created actually by the abolitionists that wanted to attach their cause to his works, and they misrepresented the works. Because if anybody reads those documents now, slavery was not stopped with the Emancipation Proclamation. We have to read it. We did not get equal protection under the law, which is the 14th Amendment. We did not get freed from slavery. And in fact, in the Emancipation Proclamation, you got to look at it. The slave had to free himself. If you read it, he has to attain true freedom by leaving. Read the Emancipation Proclamation. But again, great book, a lot of information, especially with Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. A lot of that relationship has been misrepresented as to know where people represent Frederick Douglass as, over the years, softening in his relationship with Lincoln. That is not true. Great book, though. Please get it. Please read it.
It's very important to note that that's one of the main things that he mentioned that's not within ambiguous terms. There's nothing to the likes of encrypted about it or anything. It's he's flat out saying that the remedy, in order to be free, you would have to leave. That is laid out for a lay mind to understand. I've always said the reversion process, the re-entry process to whatever previous state we were in, even to physically enter another regime or become a fragment off of the United States and be cornered off as a result of a specific reparation model. For any of these to be implemented as a remedy, you would have to arrive mentally, always, anywhere that you want to be in terms of this. In terms of making an actual life shift, you would have to arrive mentally, especially because we were prisoners of war. The re-entry process is not as simple as Google Maps. The psychological map is very different.